Thanks a million, guys. So I'm going to start just with a short reading. The reading is something I wrote myself actually on December 23rd, just last year, and it is very apropos the topic I want to speak about. I had no idea how many people were going to show, so I just I did a brief outline of what I'm going to do this morning. So I just did 30 copies. So if you could maybe share one between every 2 or 3 people, that'd be great. Give you some idea of the flow of the talk this morning. So you know that it's my custom in Mass every Sunday, before I read the Gospel passage, I sing a chant in Gaelic, an ancient chant in Gaelic, which goes back to about the 6th century. It's called Yisa Achlan Machrisha, and there's a translation in the books. And it's basically a prayer of asking for Christ consciousness. And so before I do the reading, I just want to start with that chant. And a bunch of you know this, so join in with me. O Yisa Glan Machrisha Goglechlan Gochla Esa Yisa Cher Minzing Wheelers Macht Dachra Den muss Mwinza Gofirchlan Agus Brera Movail Esa Hirna Ayelish Stjorichiha Mohail. So this was something I wrote on December 23rd, 2009, and the name I gave it was Calling God Names. He was finally old enough to understand and grateful enough to begin repaying the debt. He was a 3-month-old kitten that had been rescued by my friend Arlen, whose mission in life is to find and protect abandoned animals. He had been the recipient of her unconditional love, nursed back to health by her naturopathic genius, and invited into self-confidence by her willingness to accept all of his idiosyncrasies. He now deluged her with gifts. He started by chasing golden autumn leaves around her back garden. They attempted to dodge his attentions by hitching rides on a passing wind. He would pounce on a leaf, spear it with his sharp claws, clamp it firmly in his mouth, bring it inside the house, and lay it triumphantly at her feet. She accepted without demur. Then one day he graduated to hunting fauna. His practice with leaves had proved invaluable, and soon he caught a little mouse. He pushed his way through the animal flap in the back door and presented Arlen with this new token. The greatest gift an animal can give us humans is to first draw us into their reality and then bestow membership of their species upon us. Sometimes we reciprocate by anthropomorphizing them, ascribing all kinds of human characteristics to Fido or Fluffy. Mostly, however, we reserve that kind of compliment for God. The greatest honor we can bestow on God is to make him one of us, to make him a personal God, to give him a mega human personality, and to define him by ascribing to him human traits. He must just love the leaves and the mice that we lay at his feet as we attempt to explain him in human terms. Because of this, if the mystics ever put words to their experiences of God, it is always in metaphors, analogies, parables, and poetry. So I will imitate them and end this essay in such a fashion. God is the curiosity of a kitten and the ecstatic, playful gambling of a lamb. God is the unconditional, face-licking forgiveness of a puppy. and the solid groundedness of a mountain. God is the creative resilience of the grasses and the unfettered freedom of the winds. God is the happy giggling of the creek and the seductive winking of a star on a frosty night. God has already taken out membership of all her created species, but she has a citizenship that transcends them all. So if you offer God a leaf or a mouse, incense or Eucharist, the Hajj or Puja, be prepared to laugh hilariously at these feeble attempts to detain her within your own private trance. A word inspired by God. There's a great story in the Talmud. The Talmud is the book of the Hebrew wisdom that reflects upon the teachings in its scriptural tradition and moves them forward a little bit. There's one great story in the Talmud about 4 very holy men. They're called in Hebrew, they're called tzaddikim, or kind of enlightened ones. 4 people who are sequentially invited to visit in paradise with God. They're not dying, but they're invited one by one to go and visit in paradise and have an encounter with God. And the first guy that goes in, he's called Ben Azai. And Ben Azai goes in, and because of what happens, he dies with fright. Sometime later, the second guy goes in, his name is Ben Zoma. And Ben Zoma goes in, and because of what's there, he goes mad. He literally goes mad. He can't handle it. And the third guy goes in, his name is Akar. And Akar goes in, and because of what happens there, he loses his faith. He becomes a total atheist. And the fourth guy goes in, he's called Rabbi Akiba. And only Rabbi Akiba goes in to paradise, visits there, and comes back out without ever losing his serenity. Because Rabbi Akiba was the only one of the 4 who realized that even the absence of God is God. The others couldn't handle it. One of them died with fright, one of them went mad, and the other guy lost his faith. Only Rabbi Akiba got it, that the absence of God, even the absence of God, is God. Now this is reflected in the Buddhist tradition, with a great saying they have. They say, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. So what they mean by this is, whatever kind of theologies you construct and you think that they describe who God is, kill it before it kills your spiritual journey. So if you meet the Buddha on the road, they say, kill him. In Christian mysticism, it's put very, very beautifully by a 14th century Christian mystic, a Dominican called Meister Eckhart. And he said famously one time, he said, I prayed daily to God to rid me of God. In other words, I petition Source, the ineffable ground of my being, about which I can say nothing, but which I can experience. I petition Source daily to rid me of the little God which is constructed by our theologians. And so that's what I was trying to say in this little story as well, that our attempts to domesticate God or to explain God are like kittens trying to invite us into their reality by giving us gifts of mice or leaves. And for us to talk about God, it's the same thing we're doing. We're attempting to lay little things at the feet of God, hoping somehow that they capture who God is. So that's where I want to start today. In the introduction, I just want to explain that when people typically talk about God, they'll use one of 4 kinds of languages. So I'm going to mention what the 4 of them are. And then for the purposes of just today's talk, I'm going to focus on 2 of those categories. So the first category that people employ when they talk about God is called, in Greek, it's called Cataphatic theology. And this is an attempt to ontologically describe who God is. And this is what theologians attempt to do. Theologians are constantly trying to attempt to describe who God is and what she had for breakfast. So that's called cataphatic language. And it's the language that uses the word is. God is X, or God is Y, or God does Z. That's cataphatic language. And obviously, it won't get you anywhere. It will only describe your own fantasy or describe your own kind of cosmology. It does not describe who God is. So there's a second kind of language, which is called in Greek, is called Apophatic. And I've put these in the notes here. Apophatic. And this is the language of the mystics. Mystics will say X, God is not X. Y, God is not Y. Z, God is not Z. So you can only kind of back into the experience of God by ruling out what she is not. So that's the language that the mystics will use constantly, apophatic language. And that's one of the two I'll focus on in the remainder of the talk. The third one is parabolic language. And this is the language that says God is like. So Cataphatic says God is, Apophatic says God is not, Parabolic says God is like. And this is the language of the teachers. The first language is the language of theologians, the second is the language of mystics, the third is the language of teachers. Even when the mystics are forced to attempt to speak to us about God or their experiences of the divine, if they have to use language, they will choose to use parabolic language. And so you look at Jesus. Jesus, in talking about the kingdom of heaven or about God, he will never say, God is, or the kingdom of heaven is. He will never say that. He will say rather, the kingdom of heaven is like a farmer going out to sow a seed, or the kingdom of heaven is like a fisherman throwing his net in the ocean, or the kingdom of heaven is like a woman baking bread and putting yeast into it, or the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in pursuit of great pearls. So he will always use is like language. So this is the language that teachers will use if they have to try to speak about the experience of God. And the fourth language is the evolutionary language, and this is the language about how God grows, or rather how our understanding of God evolves. And this is the language employed by historians. So given that we just have I have maybe 35, 40 minutes to present my thesis this morning, I'm going to focus on just two of these language groups. I'm going to focus on apophatic language and say what I think God is not, and I'm going to focus then on historical language and say how our ideas of God have evolved throughout the ages. And some of this material is material I've treated over the last 5 or 6 months in homilies, and I did a session on it in a recent retreat up at Bishop's Ranch. But I really feel that it is so important in our times to wrestle with this notion, because so much of our energy is wasted, it seems to me, following and trying to appease and sacrifice to, or even experience, a God who is not God. So it's very important for us to try to wrestle with this and straighten in our own minds what we're talking about and what we're experiencing. So section A then will be apophatic language, what God is not. And I have 5 subcategories here. The first thing God is not is that God is not a person. So we attempt, like Ireland's kitten, to try to treat human beings as if they're just members of their species. So kittens invite us to become cats or felines like them. And that's the greatest compliment they can bestow upon us. And then they give us gifts that would be gifts to them. They presume they would be gifts to us, leaves and mice. Now we do the very same thing with God. And one of the things we do with God is we think the greatest compliment you can bestow on somebody is to offer them personhood. So we make God a person. In fact, a kind of a mega person. Now, where did this come from? Because obviously God is not a person. So where does this notion come from? It has a kind of an interesting trajectory which is misunderstood en route. The early Greek fathers, as they began to try to wrestle with the experience of the ineffable, they came up with the notion of, the word they used was prosopon. And prosopon in Greek means the mask that an actor wears when he comes on stage. So when a Greek actor came on stage, he had a plethora of different kinds of masks. And depending on which mask he came on stage wearing, he was cluing the audience in as to what kind of character they might expect. So if he came on stage with a mask that looked like this, it was going to be a comedy. If he came on stage with a mask that looked, it was going to be a tragedy. But they had a whole bunch of masks. And the word in Greek for a mask is prosopon. So the early fathers were saying, you know, we can't really say anything about God. All we can say is we have experiences of the ineffable source, and our experiences happen in particular kinds of ways. Sometimes they happen in kind of tragic circumstances. Sometimes they happen in happy moments. Sometimes they happen in nature. Sometimes they happen in meditation. So we'll use a whole bunch of different masks. They don't describe who God is. The masks do not describe who God is. They describe rather what it's like for us to experience the ineffable mystery. So the masks describe our experiences. They do not describe God. When the Latins, the Romans, translated this word into Latin, they chose the word persona to translate prosopon. Now persona, when you think about it, just literally means, it's still a mask. It means that through which you sound. Per means through, and sona is the word from which we get sonar, or sound. And so it's just another way to describe mask is someplace. There's 2 holes that you can look through, and there's a mouth you can speak through. So persona just literally meant something through which you sound. So it just literally means a mask. So the Latins now are translating this notion that we have experiences of the ineffable source, and these experiences fall into different kinds of categories. And so it's as if we're wearing masks that allow us to experience different facets of this experience. Now, unfortunately, in time, this word persona will translate into person and personality. And it'll be taken up by psychology. And we think that then a person is a human entity. And therefore, the word that was used, persona, which just literally meant a mask, now becomes an ontologically discrete individual. And now God, it becomes a person. So God, we backed God into personhood through the misunderstanding of the Greek and the Latin origins. So God is not a person in our sense of the word. God could not be described by a personality inventory and kind of we say he has particular kinds of qualities. She doesn't have any of these qualities. We can say nothing about God. We can only experience it. We can really experience it, but we can't say anything about the experience because our language skills and our cognitive processes are not the faculties that allow us to be in contact with Source, and therefore they can't describe that which, that which they can't contact, they can't experience. There's a different part of us that experiences the mystery. And that part, either chooses not to speak or finds language totally inadequate to describe the experience. So we're backed into an understanding that God is a person. God is not a person. So that's the first apophatic. X, God is not X. Person, God is not person. The second thing God is not is that God is not a creator. I do not believe God is a creator. I do not believe that there is some ineffable source in the sky which one day decided, I think I'm going to create giraffes. And then all of a sudden, there's this long creature with 4 long legs and a long, long neck, and bingo, giraffes arrive in the world. And then the next day God says, I think I'll create, what'll I create next? Primroses. And all of a sudden there's a beautiful little flower, about 3 inches off the ground, and then we have primroses. That God goes around having ideas and then creating ex nihilo, to fill this. God is not that. That is not what God is. Probably the greatest philosopher of all time was a man called Plotinus. He was a Roman-speaking, Greek citizen, Egyptian-born philosopher who lived in Alexandria and who traveled throughout the known world. He visited Persia and experimented with Zoroastrianism. He went to India even. So he was an extraordinary genius. He said at one stage that it's not a question of creatio ex nihilo. It is not about God creating something out of nothing. It is a question of emanatio ab Deo. It is emanation from Source. And I agree totally with him. For me, Source is such a thing that its very nature is to emanate and to manifest eventually. So in the same way, to use an example, last Christmas somebody gave me a gift of a little pot with a bulb in it. I had no idea what the bulb was going to develop into. And I put it on my window, and the instructions were very simple. Keep the soil moist. Even I could do that. And so every week I'd stick my finger in it, and if it was really dry, I'd put water in it. And just about 3 weeks ago, suddenly it developed this long green shoot. And about 2 weeks later, 4 huge big purple trumpet flowers came out of it. Now in a sense, that's my understanding that it's not that at some stage the bulb decided to create a stalk, ex nihilo. And then a few weeks later, the stalk decided to create 4 trumpet flowers, ex nihilo. It is that the essence of the bulb was such that it would eventually emanate a stalk, which would eventually result in 4 trumpet flowers. Now that's my sense of Plotinus, and it's my sense as well of when we talk about Source. That Source is that which emanates, and that all of manifestation is merely, and I'm going to use a big jawbreaker that I've used for you before, that all manifestation is the densification of the intentionality of the intelligence of Source. Now, it's a big jawbreaker. What do I mean by that? I mean that everything that exists in the phenomenological realms, that which can be experienced, is simply the progressive densification of the intentionality of the intelligence of Source. There is some kind of intelligence at Source. When that intelligence forms an intention, that intention begins to manifest, and there are layers of manifestation from the very dense to the very subtle. So as the process begins, God, who is beyond categories obviously, first what comes is some kind of causal emanation. And from that comes subtle sub-emanations, and from those come from gross physical emanations. So if I were to take the Hindu model, there is Source, and somehow from Source emanates individual souls who are very, very subtle creatures. And from these souls emanate psychic abilities, which are slightly less subtle than souls. From that comes mind, which is less subtle still. From mind comes emotions, and from emotions comes the etheric body, and finally the physical body. So the physical body, in a sense, is the densest articulation of the intentionality of the intelligence of Source. Now, unfortunately, we think that the more dense something is, the more real it is. So somehow this is more real than an idea. And it's exactly the opposite. The less dense an emanation is, the nearer to Source it is, and therefore the more real it is. So we're stuck in a world with a scientific model which tells us that nothing is real if it's not sensible, if it can't be detected by our senses, our sensorium, or by extension through our instrumentation. And that is exactly wrong. That is the least important reality. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. It does exist. It's got its own rules and regulations, but it's the least important manifestation from Source. The more subtle a manifestation is, the nearer to Source it is. And that's why our journey back to God is a question of learning to access progressively more and more subtle realms, so that we learn to disidentify with this physical gross body of ours. I'm not saying that we abandon it or neglect it. We need to celebrate it and to love it, but it's merely a resource for living at the densest level of manifestation. We need to be able to transcend that and experience ourselves at the etheric level, at the astral level, at the mental level, at the causal level, at the soul level, and ultimately at the level of Source itself. So God then, as far as I'm concerned, is not a creator, but an emanator. And everything that we come across is a proof of this emanation. And it's important for us to learn how to grade the importance of the different levels of manifestation. We live in a world that we're largely destroying because, and in spite of the fact that we think it's the only reality. You think if we knew it was the only reality, we'd at least try to hold on to it and preserve it. But here's the paradox. Because we've reduced all of reality down to the physical gross level, we're trashing it. Only by re-identifying with all of the other levels will we save planet Earth. So that's the second thing God is not. The third thing God is not is that God is not a partisan divinity. But all the peoples of the world at various stages have acted as if that they were somehow God's special patrimony. And you find this all over the world. We're more au fait with the Judeo-Christian model, but you find it all over the world. When I lived in Kenya for 14 years, the Maasai were totally convinced that God had made all the cattle of the earth for the Maasai. Totally. That was their cosmology. They were God's chosen people, and all of the cattle of the earth belonged to the Maasai, and they had a duty to repatriate all those cattle. So they were constantly going on cattle raids to take back cattle from the Kikuyu, who had cattle that obviously belonged to the Maasai, or they were raiding the Kalenjin to take back cattle that obviously belonged to the Maasai. So there's the mentality of the Maasai. They're God's chosen people. All the cattle belong to them. They need to take them back home. The Japanese believed that they were the special patrimony of God, the sun god, and then you can find the sun on their flag. That there's a particular god who has a particular interest in the Japanese, and they are God's chosen people. The Jews obviously were convinced that a god called Yahweh picked those out and made them his special patrimony. We're totally convinced they're God's chosen people. Christianity bumps Judaism aside and says, no, extra ecclesiam nulla est salus. Outside of the Catholic Church, there is no salvation. We are God's new chosen people, and nobody can find salvation if it be not through us. The Catholics would hold this position. The Irish are the only group who got it right. The Irish know they're God's chosen people. Yeah, but so at least one group got it right. So then we find ourselves then that typically there's a belief that there's a chosen race, that there's a chosen prophet, there's a special prophet, and each one of these groups has a special prophet they believe is the one and only or the most important. So in the case of Judaism, it's Moses. In the case of Christianity, it's Jesus. In the case of Islam, it's Muhammad. So every one of these groups, there's a chosen people, there's a chosen prophet, there's a chosen scripture. And so it's going to be the Tanakh for the Hebrews, it's going to be the New Testament for the Christians, it's going to be the Quran for the Muslims. Each group believes there's a very special scripture which supersedes all other scriptures. And then finally, that there's a special language, that there's a holy language, that for Hindus it's Sanskrit, for the Jews it's Hebrew. For the Christians, initially it was Greek, then it became Latin, and then finally became English with an American accent. So, and for Muslims, obviously, it's Arabic. So every one of us, every group has acted as if God, you had a special interest in this particular group, gave us a special prophet, a special language, and a special revelation. So that's the third thing God is not. The fourth thing I believe that God is not is that God is not a lawman. You know, most of us act as if God created, gave, enforces, and punishes laws and law breaking. God is not a lawmaker in that sense of the word. And it's interesting to me that even though the Judeo-Christian model and the Islamic model ascribes all laws to God, somehow God is above these laws. So of all the important laws this God of monotheism gave to us, maybe primary among them is the law that you're not supposed to kill. Thou shalt not kill. But does God keep that law? Absolutely not. God at one stage wiped out the entire experiment. He literally drowned 99.999% of human beings, in spite of the fact that he just told us, thou shalt not kill. So it seems it didn't apply to God. This God we created didn't have to keep the law of not killing. But even his chosen people didn't have to keep this law. Even though he says, thou shalt not kill, it was permissible to kill people who weren't part of the chosen people. Not only was it permissible, it was actually mandated in some instances. There are instances where we're told, God allegedly saying to the people, I want you to kill every man, every woman, every child, every ox, and every ass when you conquer this particular city. And they acted upon it. And Judaism has acted upon it, Islam has acted upon it, Christianity has acted upon it. But then it gets even worse, because not only is it bad that God doesn't keep the law, not only is it bad that God enjoins his chosen people to disregard this particular law when they're treating others outside the group, we can even disregard it when we're treating people inside the group under certain circumstances. So within Christianity, for instance, having killed those outside it, the Jews and the Saracens and the Greek Orthodox in our crusades that swept across Europe for almost a century, we then turned on ourselves. And in the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries, we began inquisiting our own, pulling people asunder literally limb by limb. So where did this law go to, that thou shalt not kill? Nobody keeps this law, it seems. So we ascribe this law to God. God doesn't keep it. The chosen people don't keep it in their dealings with the others outside, and they don't even keep it in their dealings with themselves. Now, there are laws of the cosmos. In fact, there are laws at every level of the cosmos. There are cosmic laws, but these are not of human origin. And the apex and the culmination of all these laws, and I've talked about these laws a few times in homilies. I've identified for myself about 13 such cosmic laws. But the most important one of all is that all of evolution, in my opinion, the evolution of every level of manifestation is only headed in one direction. Unfortunately, Tyler Desjardins got there about 40 years before me. He identified point omega, that everything is ultimately evolving to point omega. And his language for that was point omega is kind of Christ consciousness. My language, in a sense, is that everything that exists, all manifestation, in all of these dimensions, at all of these levels, is evolving until finally all manifestation operates totally and only out of love. It's the first and it is the last law of the cosmos, that everything evolves into the realization that only love works. So only in that sense is God a lawmaker. Not in the sense that he gives particular precepts as to how to conduct sociological interactions, but that the universe in which we find ourselves, both the physical and the metaphysical universe, is created in certain ways, and our job is to find out what the rules are and follow them into love. And the fifth thing that God is not, in my opinion, is that God is not a micromanager. Now, the big difference between deism and theism is this one difference. Deists are people who believe that God is a creator who fashioned this universe and then after a while lost interest in it. So it has no more to do with the cosmos. And the cosmos is just bumbling along in its own particular fashion. Theists, like the monotheists, Judaism, Islam and Christianity, believe that God not only created the world but micromanages it. And he's constantly intervening, and he gets really upset when things aren't going according to plan. Now, my belief obviously then is this is not true. God is not a micromanager in any sense. In fact, I've said to you many times, I believe that God has no will for planet Earth. God does not have an agenda for planet Earth. God has built into the cosmic laws an evolution toward love, but God has no specific will for any peoples or any interactions between anybody. God allows us to proceed and to make these kinds of decisions. Because part of what's evolved in this manifestation, four facets that I think guide the process. The first one is that we have free will. We're the first creatures on this planet that we know of, and that may be grandiose, but as far as we know, we're the first creatures that have free will. We can make choices. Most of the rest of nature are responding to their life circumstances instinctively. We are the first group who get to exercise free will. But free will is meant to morph into freedom. There's a big difference between free will and freedom. Free will is simply the right and the ability to do as I please. Freedom is the ability to do as God pleases, or as the plan or cosmic laws please. And so free will is just the right to, say no, or do anything I want to do it. Take your property, whatever I need to do. Freedom is beautifully defined in Catholic theology. Freedom is the ability to choose the good. I'm only totally free when I choose the good. If I choose anything less than the good, I'm not free, because I'm addicted in some fashion to something that I need to do or need to have. And so free will does not confer freedom, but it's the road to freedom. But it's a long, winding and difficult trajectory that needs to be taken consciously and worked at. And ultimately, the most important weapon we then have is to move into freedom. So all our choices are dictated by love and by trying to do the good. So that's the first navigational tool we have in this universe. The second one is what I've called in the past preconception contracts. That groups of souls migrate from incarnation to incarnation with each other, setting up particular kinds of dramas, assigning each other particular roles and particular kinds of racial relationships. And the object of the exercise only and always is to find out, in this particular configuration of circumstances, could you love anyway? If you were born a slave girl in North Africa in the 1300s, could you learn to love anyway? If you were born a CEO in Silicon Valley in the year 1960, could you learn to love anyway? No matter what circumstance you find yourself in, could you learn to love anyway? And we come in groups. We are roped together. I've used this image before. We're like climbers on K2. We are roped together as a team, but we forget that and we cut the umbilical cords that bind us, and we attempt to operate as individuals in competition with each other rather than a team in cooperation with each other. So that's the second navigational tool we have, the preconception contracts that we come in with. The third one is prayer. And prayer is not that we are attempting to bend the arm of ineffable source to our own particular personal agenda. That is not prayer. Prayer has nothing got to do with God. Prayer has nothing got to do with God. Prayer is the laserization of human consciousness so that we open ourselves up to being totally, crystally clear vessels and channels for love and grace to flow through the systems. And therefore prayer is very effective, because the intentionality of holding somebody in my consciousness with that kind of love is very powerful. Whether the target is somebody who's physically ill or emotionally disturbed or whatever it is, the level of intentionality that comes from a crystal clear container beaming love at somebody is really powerful. That's the purpose of prayer. It's not to bend God to our purposes. And finally, there is an agreement that even as we incarnate, we do not dedicate anything like even 50% of our soul force to the incarnational experience. There's a part of us that always remains at source, and Hinduism will call this part Atman. And there's a part that will incarnate, and they call this part Jiva. And there's a constant connection between Atman and Jiva, except this culture doesn't honor that, but it's there. We are constantly in communication with that part of us which remains at source. It is that part of us which gives us deja vu experiences, dreams, synchronicities, sudden insights, sends teachers our ways, sometimes stops us in our tracks with an illness of various kind. It's constantly communicating with us and trying to guide us back into alignment with our stated mission on planet Earth. And we can access that through meditation, through deep thought, through our prayer life. So there's a communication. So God is not micromanaging this stuff. This is a pre-agreed upon contract among ourselves. So that's the first huge section then, the apophatic language. I'm going to move for a few minutes then into the second kind of language I want to address, and that's kind of evolutionary language, the language that we apply to how we've grown God up in the course of our life. Now, one of the things you discover when you start paying attention to this is that gods have been invented, hired, promoted, demoted, and fired more frequently than CEOs are in Silicon Valley. And there's huge archaeological and historical evidence for that. But we were blinders, we don't realize that. We think that the notion of God we have now was always the notion of God that the Catholic Church had, or always the notion of God that Judaism had, or always the notion of God that humans had. Not so. We've invented gods, we've hired them, we've fired them, we've promoted them, and we've demoted them at an alarming rate. So it's very important for us to begin looking, and this is archaeological evidence and this is historical evidence. You don't have to dig very, very deeply to find this to be the case. But most of us are ignorant of that, and we continue to worship, ancient versions of God. So I'm just going to take 3 sub-components to this and look at how our notions of God might have emerged. And at the risk of stretching you beyond your comfort level, I'm going to talk again about a theory that makes sense to me, but that perhaps doesn't make sense to you. The oldest civilization on this planet, everybody agrees, is the Sumerian civilization. 5,800 years ago, from nowhere apparently, this extraordinary civilization blossomed into the fullness of its being almost overnight. They're the first ones who gave us astronomy, mathematics, geometry, multi-rise buildings, agriculture, orthographies, writing, religion, temples, priesthood, marriage, contracts, taxation systems. Literally, they invented all of these things. And it seems from nowhere. No other civilization had done it at that stage. So where did that come from? According to themselves, and there are tens of thousands of artifacts and written documentation on steles saying how they explain this. And their explanation was that 445,000 years ago, a group of extraterrestrials came onto planet Earth looking for resources, particularly gold, to repair a hole in their own planetary's atmosphere. And they came down, a small group of them, about 300, and they colonized, firstly, in the Middle East, that area, and they mined gold in the waters of the Persian Gulf. But they quickly ran out of it, and they transferred their operation down to South Africa, and they'd go much, much deeper. There was back-breaking work, and finally some of the ordinary workers said, we're not going to do this anymore. And they gave up. And so at that stage, the Anunnaki scientists and the medical technicians, they took a group of hominids, and through in vitro fertilization, they genetically modified a particular group of hominids that they might be suitable workers for them. And they trained them as miners, and they trained them as gardeners, and they trained them as domestic help. And finally, when these individuals themselves were at war with each other, as they did, they trained them as soldiers. And this went on for a long period of time. And then finally, when they decided to leave, they decided to transfer government to a chosen individual called Enmedoranki. And they taught him governance, and they taught him rules and laws, and they taught him science and astronomy and mathematics. And they put him in charge of, outfit Earth. And then they went back into the skies in their spaceships. Now, there's some kind of a lingering archetype you'll find in all cultures of the world. And I've always been fascinated by mythologies. I've investigated this. I lived in Africa. I was raised on the Celtic mythology. I haven't come across any culture anywhere which doesn't have some kind of a myth about gods who came from the skies in some kinds of fiery chariots or some kinds of space vehicles, came down here and created us and gave us our rules and our religion and our laws and our priesthood. There's something in the race consciousness about some kind of external intervention that resulted in our being created, in our become children of God, in the laws we have, the religions we have, and the science we have. Something is locked in the human psyche about this. Now, is it that we all independently of each other made up this myth, or is this some kind of historical residue from a real life thing that happened? My opinion personally is that it is real, and that most of exoteric religion is the fact that we started worshipping these creatures for some obvious reasons. They seemed to be eternal. They lived on a planet that circled the sun only once every 3,600 years. And so their longevity is much, much, much more extensive, tens of thousands of years of age. So as far as we were concerned, they're eternal beings. They made us in their own image and likeness, which they did according to the Sumerians. They gave us our laws and everything we have, and then they went back to heaven. And so as far as we're concerned, they're gods. And we started using this word to them. But what they gave us was just what I would call exoteric religion. They gave us form, and they gave us dogma, and they gave us regulation, and they gave us law. They did not give us mysticism because they were a culture focused on technology, but not on spirituality. But there's something within the human psyche which is much deeper than these people and much longer, and that is Everything is an emanation from source. So there's a part of us which is much deeper and much older, which knows that religion cannot just be about that. It can't be about dogma. It can't be about worshipping people who went into the sky and came back. It's about the ineffable. And that mysterious sense has existed side by side, and we call it the esoteric or the mystical wing. It's existed side by side with the exoteric. But the exoteric has always punished it and driven it underground. But in our times, it's coming to the fore again and again and again. So that's my personal understanding. When you look at the given wisdom, there's a different story emerges. So that's section B, subsection B. The hunter-gatherers. I want to trace for a few minutes what the kind of the given wisdom is, how religion evolved in our planet. And that's a slightly different story. Now I think actually it dovetails with the Anunnaki story, but as far as kind of modern sociologists or anthropologists or paleoanthropologists are concerned, this is the more realistic version. And this says simply that about 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens sapiens emerged. And Homo sapiens sapiens is human beings who can think about thinking. Therefore we develop language skills. And because we can now think about thinking, we began to wrestle with the notion of where do we come from? Who's in charge here? How does nature operate? Are there laws, regulations? Is there a system here? Are there patterns? Are there rhythms to this? We began to wrestle with all of these things. And the first and most important conclusion we came to is that there must be something who created this or who manifested this or was in charge of this. So our first response to the notion of the world around us was to create beings who were bigger than us. So in other words, we created beings who could explain the phenomena that we couldn't explain ourselves. Now there are 3 stages to this process. The first thing we do is to try to explain the situations in which we find ourselves. The second thing we do is to try to, once we've established what the laws are, we can start predicting why things are happening or when things will happen in the future. And then finally, we try to create control over these. So the movement is from explanations to prediction to control. And that's where the process headed. And that's where the evolution of religion happened according to the more given wisdom. So we created gods to try to explain that which we didn't yet understand. And these gods then were people who were responsible for most of this. Particularly, we were wrestling with the notion of what's in theology is called theodicy. The notion of why do bad things happen to good people. And every culture has wrestled with this. And the most simplistic explanation is that we're the result of displaced aggression. That these gods up here who are always warring with each other, and in all mythologies they war with each other, we are kind of, the least on the totem pole, so they vent their frustration on us. So it's like, I have a fight with my wife, I'm not allowed to argue with my wife, so I go out in the backyard and I kick the dog, because the dog is the lowest one on the totem pole. That these gods who are warring up here, because the little guys can't, overcome the big ones, they vent their aggression, their displaced aggression in human beings. That was the first response to theodicy. And then finally, these gods are reduced to try to back up moral codes. When we finally become more and more fruitful on the earth and there are more and more of us, it becomes more important to have rules of engagement and moral laws. So we appeal to the gods as the originators of these laws to try to create some kind of coherence within the system. You look at these gods that are created even in that model, what do they look like? They have huge egos. They're always at war with each other. They visit their vengeance upon us. They intervene constantly in human affairs. And the only way we can kind of deal with them is somehow to try to placate them, offer them some kinds of sacrifices. Maybe they'll be satisfied by taking our firstborns. So let's kill our firstborn and give them back to them. Or then maybe let's just kill animals and give those back to them. So we've constantly tried to placate the gods by sacrificing them. Except, of course, none of these were gods. They were either gods we created out of our need, or they were misplaced adulation of just technologically superior civilizations like the Anunnaki. Section C then there, I just want to look at our particular version of God. If you grew up in the Judeo-Christian world, then you grew up worshiping a God called Yahweh. So I want to look at, what's the deal with Yahweh? Is he really the ultimate source of all that is? The problem is when we start reading our biblical accounts, we have a Bible which has been redacted and edited constantly, and older or newer ideas are retroactively inserted into older texts to try to create the agenda of a later period. So there's a lot of anachronism when you start reading the scriptural traditions. So when you try to ferret down beyond all of that, what's the deal here? So for instance, the given wisdom is that Moses was the first monotheist. Yeah? Moses flourished about 1250 years before Jesus Christ. And the given wisdom was that he was the first monotheist. Nothing is further from the truth. Very probably there was no Moses, And very probably there was no exodus out of Egypt. There is no historical evidence and there's no archaeological evidence whatsoever for the existence of either Moses or the exodus out of Egypt, in spite of the fact it's the foundation myth of Judaism. But the given wisdom was that Moses gave us monotheism. You look at the Ten Commandments themselves, it's obvious, even if Moses existed, the Ten Commandments themselves are not monotheistic. The very first one says, first, I am the Lord your God. You're not allowed to have foreign gods ahead of me. Whoever made up this law knows that there are many gods, but I am your God. I've got a particular contact with you. You're not allowed to put other gods in front of me. It is not monotheistic. It's what's called monolatry. In other words, the worship of a particular God. But it's not monotheism, the belief that there is only one God. It's monolatry, the agreement to worship just a specific deity. Monotheism does not come into Judaism for more than 700 years after Moses allegedly existed. So we were raised on this myth that Judaism came from a decree where God appeared to Moses in the burning bush and told Moses he's the only God. That was not true of Moses whatsoever. What is much more likely when you look at the historical evidence and the archaeological evidence, particularly what are called the Ugaritic evidence, lots of artifacts coming to light in modern Israel over the last 50 or 60 years. What's much more likely was that sometime around the year 1100 BC, two groups of tribes in present-day Israel merged in a kind of a federation. That there were two groups in the southern part of the country who were following a particular god whose name was Yahweh, and there were 10 tribes in the northern part who were worshipping a god whose name was El. And in fact, both of these names are in the Bible constantly. And this northern group had their chief god was El, but there were lesser divinities. And for some reason, these two groups of tribes made a federation about the year 1100, and they had to try to sort out their pantheon at that stage. And the agreement they came to was that El would continue to be the chief god, but that Yahweh would be adopted as one of El's sons, and that El would divide the Middle East between his sons, and that this particular son of his, newly adopted son, would get this particular portion of land that we would call modern-day Israel. And so that was how the agreement came into being. So the first king to experience that would have been David. David flourished about 1000 BC. And for the first 7 years of his life, David was king only over the two southern tribes. And then for the next 33 years, he's king over the combined 12 groups. You can find this in the Bible. He's only king for the first 7 years over the two southern tribes. After that, he's elected king of the entire group, the entire federation. So for the life of David, so he's now king for about 40 years, he rules over a united federation of tribes. His son Solomon also rules over this federation. But when Solomon dies, which is about the year 930 BC, the kingdom split again. There's civil war between several of his sons. And so it's divided up into the old alliance. The two southern tribes are separate, and now their headquarters is in Jerusalem, and the 10 northern tribes are separated. So now again, Yahweh and El, the two pantheons, begin to diverge. In the year 721, the great Assyrian Empire came in, and it conquered the 10 northern tribes. So now, in a sense, El is demolished. And now, by default, Yahweh finds himself the only God in the land. So now he's been elevated from being a junior member of the pantheon to being the only God in the region. In the year 598, however, the two southern tribes are overcome by the Babylonians, who in the meantime have conquered the Assyrians. And now the last two tribes themselves are taken into exile. So you would imagine that Yahweh's days were now numbered, and that would be the end of Yahweh. Some extraordinary sleight of hand and some brilliant thinking rescued Yahweh. So Yahweh started to put out the word, or at least his theologians started to put out the word, that he was the God above all gods, because listen to what he had done. He had used the god of the Assyrians, a guy called Asura. He had used Asura to demolish El, and therefore he's superior to both El and Asura. And then he used the god of Babylon, Marduk, to demolish Asura. So now Yahweh is using Marduk to demolish the guy who demolished El. So now he's further up the chain. And then in the year 529, when the Persians overthrew the Babylonians, now Yahweh has used the god of the Persians, Ahura Mazda, to demolish the god of the Babylonians, Marduk, who demolished the god of the Assyrians, Asura, who demolished the god of the 10 northern tribes, who was El. And now by default, Yahweh is suddenly the only god in the region. And that's how Yahweh backs in to monotheism. And that process happened 700 years after. the alleged existence of Moses, about the year between 550 BC and 529 BC, when the Israelites come back into the land of Israel. That is how Yahweh backs into a position of being the only God. So now we've gone from polytheism to monolatry, the worship of a particular God, to monotheism, the belief that there is only one God. And that's the God you and I grew up in. And that's his history. So we want to continue, worshipping somebody who backed into a position by sleight of hand or by theological kinds of, magical work. We can continue to do that. And then we have to continue to explain away why all of these viciousnesses appear in our scriptures, both in the New Testament and the Old Testament, that it's okay to kill people in the name of this schizophrenic God. Then we're facing a world that's going to do precisely that. Which brings me to my final section. God's future prospects. And there are two possibilities here, seems to me. The first one is I call the God of the gaps. And that's a belief system that science eventually is going to explain everything about life to us. And that God, in fact, is just a kind of a stopgap measure to kind of put in place for that part that we still haven't yet explained. So he's called the God of the gaps. So as science becomes more and more proficient at explaining the world, God's portfolio is going to shrink more and more and more until finally he presides over nothing at all. And science will be God. That's one version of science. But it's not real science, it's scientism. Scientism is the belief system that nothing is real unless it's physically sensible, either by our sensorium or by extension through our instrumentation. It's not real science. Real science is the unprejudiced pursuit of the entire range of human experiences. Nothing is out of its compass. Scientism is a very, very narrow bias slice that says only this is real, therefore only that deserves to be studied. And in that model, there's no place for God. Eventually God is forced out completely. The fight then has been between scientism on one hand and fundamentalist religion on the other hand. Fundamentalist religion has created a caricature of God, a little bit like the God I've explained here, and scientism has responded by demolishing this straw man that fundamentalist religion has created. They're well suited to each other, but there is no conflict between real science and deep mystical spirituality. No, nothing whatsoever. And that'll be my final point. It is a time, there has come a time in our society, it seems to me, a time in our world when we need to develop a term I coined a few years ago. I call it mysticists. And a mysticist is a combination between a mystic and a scientist. Somebody well versed in both who can take us forward. Such a person as Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a brilliant scientist in his own right and a deep mystic also, who can hold these two domains of human experience together seamlessly. That unless and until we begin getting our act together, abandoning the gods who have not served us but have separated us and put us at each other's throats, and espousing a relationship with the ineffable source, and wedding that to a real science that will truly investigate the entire range of human possibilities, until and unless we do that, there's not going to be peace in our world. So I'm going to open it up now to questions, answers, discussion, viewpoints, whatever. We'll go as long as you want to go on, I don't mind. Okay. Oh, brilliant stuff. That shows that God is a woman. Thank you. Thanks, Jenny. Diane.
Would you say more, please, about the science that investigates all human possibilities?
Okay, brilliant. At the moment, there are two things happening in science, it seems to me. One is that increasingly, funding is only available, through the military-industrial complex for most cutting-edge science, and so there's already a bias in that. And the second thing is that people who are attempting to investigate what has been pejoratively called parapsychology, clairvoyant experiences, telepathy, precognition, psychokinesis, these are being poo-pooed. They can't get really, really rigorous science, and I mean really rigorous science, which is being done by very, very good scientists in the field. They can't be published in peer-reviewed journals that are acceptable. And so, the mainstream says, well, if it was real good science, it would get published. They can't get published, so there's very little audience for them. So we find that there's a huge range of human experiences which scientism, at least, is not willing to investigate. And so real science should be the open-ended inquiry into the entire range of human experiences, whether they're mystical experiences, whether they're psychic experiences, whether they're physical experiences, emotional experiences, cognitive experiences, sociological experiences, geological experiences, whatever they are. Science should be open to investigating all of these things. More and more it's been shut down. There's been a narrow focus, and mostly, funded by a military-industrial complex that has a very, very definite agenda about how it wants to use the geniuses, in the scientific world. So I'm talking about people who investigate the entire range of human experiences. Everything can be investigated. Mystical experiences can be investigated. And the Dalai Lama is helping to do that with neurologists and neuroscientists right now. What happens in the physical brain when somebody is having a mystical experience? There will always be some kind of a biophysiological correlate to any kind of mystical experience. It's not saying that the biology is creating it or the biochemistry is inducing it, but it is the medium through which the brain is experiencing it. Al.
It seems to me that the reigning idea in science these days is governed by quantum mechanics.
Okay.
And at the root of it is uncertainty.
Totally.
We can never know precisely the position and momentum of a particle.
Fabulous. Brilliant.
Given that, assuming that that's acceptable, what can you say about uncertainty and our trying to perceive the source?
Totally. That's brilliant. You're absolutely right on. The problem is that there's always a time lag between cutting-edge science and not the technological applications. That comes very quickly, but the kind of sociological ramifications of stuff. So within the physics world, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle is exactly as you said. In the mathematical world, a brilliant mathematician way back in the 1930s came up with another similar principle in mathematics. That I'm missing his name, I can't remember what his name is, a Hungarian mathematician. I'll think of it in a few minutes. He came up with a proof that in mathematics there can be no system of postulates. What was his name? Kurt Gödel. Exactly, Kurt Gödel, Hungarian mathematician, who came up with a principle in mathematics similar to the one in physics that showed that in any mathematical system based on postulates, there has to be at least one postulate which can't be proved. In any self-referencing system of postulates, there has to be one postulate that can't be proved. That has to be taken on faith. Constantly for instance, in statistics, all of scientific inquiry and all scientific research is based on statistics. Statistics is probability theory, and it's based on numbers, which are just, 95% probability that this is true, but there's a 5% possibility it's not true. And we build mathematics on this. Mathematics is built on stuff like imaginary numbers. It used to be, the given wisdom was that any number you take and multiply it by itself was going to result in a positive number. If you take 3 and multiply it by 3, you get plus 9. If you take minus 3 and multiply it by minus 3, you still get plus 9. So you can't have a number such that when you multiply it by itself, you have a negative result. And one day some guy says, well, I'm going to make one up. I'm going to make up a number, and I'm going to postulate that when you multiply it by itself, you get a negative result. This is ridiculous. You can't do that. He said, I'm going to do it. And he called it iota. And he defined it as the square root of minus 1. So when you multiply the square root of minus 1 by the square root of minus 1, the result is minus 1. So here's a number such that when you multiply it by itself, you get a negative result. Now that might appear like that's ridiculous. What happens? All of vector analysis comes out of this. We depend upon this for our space flights. So something which is totally made up, just an idea in the mind, has extraordinary pragmatic application. So the same thing is true when we begin to realize that when you dig deeper into quantum mechanics, into mathematics, and this is one of the reasons in the Eucharistic prayer of the cosmos, I call God a mathematician and I call God a physicist. In the absence of the appropriate consciousness, nature is not free to reveal particular aspects of itself to us. If there's not the appropriate consciousness to witness it, nature can't reveal stuff. 1 billion years ago, there was no color on planet Earth. So am I saying that 1 billion years ago, the sky wasn't blue and daffodils weren't yellow and grass wasn't green? I'm saying 1 billion years ago, there was no color on planet Earth because 1 billion years ago, the eye had not yet been invented. The eye was invented 545 million years ago by a little creature called a trilobite. So the electromagnetic spectrum from which the eye can infer color, that existed, but there was no consciousness to infer color from it, so color didn't exist in the experience of this planet. So the same thing is true. It is the consciousness that we bring to the mystery that allows the mystery to birth for us that which our world needs right now. So if I stand in front of the mystery and my heart is filled with anger and fear and terrorism, the only thing nature can birth from me is anger and fear and terrorism. If I stand in front of the mystery of God and I'm filled with love and a unit of consciousness and compassion for all creatures, that and only that is what nature will birth from me. Unfortunately, people have put themselves in positions through controlling the media or controlling the political process where they insist on standing in front of the mystery with a political agenda, an economic agenda, and a scientific agenda, which is fear-based and anger-based, and the result is the world we live in right now. We desperately need mysticists to stand in front of the mystery, to stand with hearts filled with love and compassion for all God's little ones, so that nature can birth to us that which we long for in the depths of our own souls. Great question now. Yeah. Tom.
Could you expand a little bit more, Sean, on this concept of free will and then freedom? And then I'm assuming freedom is choosing good, which then would move us towards love. So where I'd like, maybe some expansion is in moving towards freedom to choose good, how do you eliminate, if you will, judgment and prejudice?
Right. Great question, Tom. So the movement obviously then is in emanation from source. There are aspects of emanation which exist in a world, where there is no morality, in the sense that there is neither good nor bad. There's just opportunity and instinctive response to opportunity. So for instance, I watch on the deck in my house, I watch, for instance, little lizards sitting very, very still, and all of a sudden a dragonfly will come back and it grabs it. And so dragonflies and lizards are pre-programmed. They don't have a moral compass to distinguish between, is this a good thing or a bad thing that I'm going to take a life? They respond instinctively to life. So there are lots of God's creatures whose purpose in life is to be totally in alignment with their instincts. But at some stage, manifestation wanted to create a more complex or a more interesting kind of life. And it threw up a form of life which had the ability to make choices. And we call this free will. So now this particular species, let's call it Homo sapiens sapiens just for fun, this particular species has the ability to think about its actions and determine from the consequence of its actions, whether it's a good thing to do or not a good thing to do. And so you get free will side by side with karma. You get the instant feedback from the environment as to whether or not, you see immediately what the results of your choices are, and then you get the decision, okay, I've done A and I got B. Do I like B? Yes, I like B. Okay, let me keep doing A. Do I not like B? No, I don't like B. Then let me stop doing B. So free will and karma go side by side with each other. They hold each other together. Now, the object of the exercise was that this species would evolve from just free will, the exercise of choice, to the exercise of choices that bring all of God's creatures into alignment with the ultimate evolutionary purpose, of manifestation, which is that everything holds together in love. And so we get the choice from just not doing what we want to do, but doing, what really aligns the entire system, not just the human system, but the entire system with source. And so we now get the opportunity of making the kinds of choices that create the good. And so the official definition will be, somebody is only truly free to the extent that they can choose the good. And St. John will say this very powerfully in one of his epistles. He will say, little children, love, and then do whatever you want. So he's not saying, pretend that you love God and then have license to be promiscuous. He's not saying that. He's saying love. And if you really love, all the choices you make will be good choices. And so there's the journey then is to move. We all experience free will. The journey is to move that free will into freedom. And the last part of your question was what, Tom? What was that? Brilliant. Okay, brilliant. So the last part then, in trying to search for the good, does there have to be prejudice and judgment? No, there doesn't. There has to be evaluation, which is different. Prejudice is painting an entire group on the basis of an interaction with a member of the group, a single member of the group. Yeah? And so prejudice is that I take very, very non-representative data from a sample from the population, and then I respond to the population on the basis of this particular sample. That's what prejudice is. Judgment is the ascribing of ontological value to a person or to an event. And I'm saying you don't need either prejudice or judgment. You need evaluation. Evaluation is different. Evaluation is the thinking, what is the appropriate response to this person in this situation? That's very different. That's not prejudice and it's not judgment. It's saying, I have a whole range of possible responses. What is the response? What is the response that creates the maximum outcome here? So it's, in that model, there is neither good nor bad. And again, many of the great mystics know this. William Shakespeare will say, there is nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. It's the thinking that creates categories, that forces a dualism on the experience. Rumi, a brilliant 13th century Persian poet, will say, out beyond right doing and beyond wrongdoing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. So it's saying that there's a place beyond morality. Morality is a minimalistic approach to the regulation of human interactions. Good is about alignment with the purpose of source. So there's a place beyond moral thinking. The categorization of people or events into good stuff and bad stuff, or lucky stuff or unlucky stuff, is, in a sense, it doesn't serve our purposes. The response that says, okay, here's a situation I find myself in with a particular person in a particular environment. What is the most loving response in the long term to this? And sometimes love is about challenge. I see Jesus loving in 4 very different ways. Sometimes love is by confirmation and saying, totally, way to go, you're doing exactly a great job. Sometimes it's by compensation, that you make up for what is lacking in the performance of the other people. Sometimes it's by confrontation, that you have to challenge people who are so seriously out of alignment that you have to hold the whole system back, bring the whole system back. And the 4th piece is complementarity, that we agree to play particular kinds of parts in the drama, and so you play one part, I'll play the other part. But all 4 pieces are part of the response, and none of them involve judgment or prejudice. They all involve evaluation. Janine was here first, and then, okay.
I'm drawn to the picture that you saw. I'm drawn to the image that you had on the screen, where there was one lamb. The reference was to Jesus, and then there was a group of sheep. And the words were something like, we are prisoners of our own prisons.
Yeah. So the entire prayer says, God, you are like a lamb gambling ecstatically in the meadow of your own mindfulness. We are the sheep peering jadedly through a prison pen of our own making.
Prison of our own making.
Yes.
And what I'm reminded, what I'm hearing is that prison of our own making seems to be the mental concepts.
Yes.
And the field beyond the mental concepts would be the field of love, it seems. And then the question is, how do I love? And that puts me into, all of us, into a place where how I love depends on the consciousness that I'm able to house. And then my struggle with, like my brother there was saying, what's the difference between judgment and discernment or evaluation? And I struggled with it all my life. It was like, when do I know if I'm judging or evaluating or discerning? And the only way I think I can know is, where's my heart? So my question to you would be, and as a human, sometimes it's very difficult to love if you cannot experience trust. Because then a little fear comes in. I don't know whether it's my ego or what, but it's very difficult to embrace something prickly or something that doesn't want to be embraced. So then what? Do you honor that space and allow it to be? That's where I'd like to go to, that field beyond thinking, and tell me more about how to love.
Okay, it's a brilliant question. Thanks, obviously, among the avatars, the one that's most kind of a model for me is Jesus the Christ. So I look to his performance constantly if I'm trying to wrestle with stories like this. And I look at Jesus in his responses to the people in his life. And almost nobody got who this guy was or what he came to do. In fact, I would like to do, if we do a second session of this at some stage, I would like to focus on the person of Jesus and do the same kind of deal with him, who he was not and who he was. But that's for later. So I look at Jesus in his lifetime, and I look at the reactions from people in his life. In Mark chapter 3, verse 21, we are told that when Jesus began his public ministry, his family came to take him by force because they thought he was mad. So the first response is his own family thought he'd flipped his lid. His aunt, when he finally started getting successful in Matthew chapter 20, verse 20, there's a story that his aunt comes to him and she says to Jesus, look, I know I've seen these disciples of yours and they're all nice boys. I knew them all growing up. They're all fishermen. I knew every one of them. But you know what? When you come into your kingdom, I want my two sons, James and John, one to sit on your right and one to sit on your left. So her agenda was she wanted her boys promoted because they're cousins of Jesus. The rest of the disciples saw Jesus as job opportunities. They were constantly arguing with themselves, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom, who gets to be his vice chancellor, who's in charge of finances for the group or whatever. So they see Jesus as a resource, a job opportunity, a career center. The mob think that Jesus is just an entertainer. He heals people. Wow, let's go watch this. He feeds people in the desert. Wow, that must be interesting. He raises the dead. Wow, this is something. Let's go watch this. So they saw him as an entertainer. The religious authorities saw him, at best as a heretic, as worst as a blasphemer, and they wanted him dead. And the secular authorities saw him as a threat. He came from Galilee, and Galilee was a hotbed of unrest. In fact, between 167 BC and 132 AD, that 300-year period, there would be 32 armed rebellions against Roman occupation in the land of Israel, and 31 of those 32 would start up in Galilee. So here's Jesus from Galilee, stirring up the mob. So almost nobody got him. I think perhaps maybe John the Beloved did, certainly Mary of Magdala did, and maybe his mother did. Maybe 3 people got it in the course of his life, who he really was, but the rest of them didn't. So how did he respond to all these people, who didn't understand how to love him? How did he love them in response? And it's very interesting. He had a different kind of a relationship with each of them. He challenged the Pharisees and the Sadducees, head on, went toe to toe with them. For his own family, he ignored them. When they told him that he's inside in the house preaching and they send in a message and say, your mother's outside and your brothers or sisters are outside, they want to talk to you. And Jesus says, who is my mother and who are my brothers, who are my sisters? My mother and my brothers and sisters are those who listen to the word of God and align themselves with it. So he ignored his family for the meantime. When he was brought face to face with Pilate, apparently they had a philosophical discussion about truth. What is truth? And he talks about, well, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were of this world, my God, my Father would send angels to rescue me from your hands. He's faced with Herod, and this is very interesting. Herod is the only character in the life of Jesus that Jesus refuses totally to exchange words with. Totally. He's dragged in front of Herod, and Herod has been really waiting for a few years to meet Jesus, this miracle worker. He's going to put on a performance for him. I know he really has to, because Herod can release him, or send him to death. So obviously, this magician is going to really have to strut his stuff and do a really good number here in order to merit, being saved. And what does Jesus do? He refused to exchange a single word with him. Because there was no place in Herod that Jesus could see then that had the slightest interest in the word of God, or the slightest interest in love, not the slightest. And Jesus had only a few breaths left. He was going to be dead within 9 or 10 hours. He wasn't going to waste precious breath talking to somebody who had zero interest in spirituality or whatever. So I look at Jesus, measure himself against all of these audiences and these occasions. And he responds in love each time. But the love is going to look very, very different from encounter to encounter. It'll be all the ways from confrontation to just ignoring what it is. And so all I can say is this, that faced with any situation, I have to try to look at what level of me is being triggered in this encounter. Is it love that's being triggered? Is it fear that's being triggered? Is it anger that's being triggered? And to catch whatever it is and say the only valid place out of which to respond is some loving place. So I have to go beyond the ego, beyond my own particular agenda, and try to align myself with my own source self, my own soul, and say, I have a body, but I'm not my body. I have emotions, but I'm not my emotions. I have an intellect, but I'm not my intellect. I have a personality, but I'm not even my personality. So the soul that's incarnated presently as Sean O'Leary with an Irish accent, when I listen to that soul, in this instance, what's the appropriate response? And it might be confrontation, it might be confirmation, it might be compensation, it might be complementarity to it. But I have to realize that whatever response comes, even if it's confrontation, it has to come from a clean heart. It can't come out of anger. Even confrontation cannot come out of anger. It must come because that is the soul's aligned response to this encounter. And so I have to keep checking my performance. And of course I fail miserably most of the time. But I have to keep checking it and saying, okay, I didn't do too well that time. You know, a similar circumstance presents itself. Could I do it a little bit better? Could I kind of make decisions and, you know, create responses from a deeper yet part of me? And so slowly by slowly, we grow, encounter by encounter, and interchange by interchange, we grow. Excellent. Jean.
Along that line of what, finishing up with what he was saying, okay, so you're going to do the most loving thing, but at what point do you have to protect yourself? You know, if we're doing the most loving thing, it might, quote, end up crucifying you. At what point do you stop because you have another purpose that might be interfered by this person who the more you love, the meaner they get?
Okay. It's a great question, of course. And of course, we must try and constantly measure ourselves against our mission. And most of us have no idea what our mission is. Why did this soul come into this incarnation as Jean Ramasiati? What was your contract with Atman? What was the Jiva contract with Atman? And what was the contract you made with the rest of these souls? If you can try and align with that, then you have a much better chance of responding out of love, even if it's love coming out as confrontation and conflict. And of course you have the right to try to protect the kind of integrity of your mission, which includes your physical spacesuit and your emotional well-being and your mental health, all these things. But you can protect it only if it doesn't lead to loss of self. If any of these things leads to loss of self, even if in order to protect my physical life, it means I have to lose my soul's mission, then better to lose my physical life than to misalign with mission. And so, but how do I get that place? Obviously, years and years and years and years of really deep work that I know that place and I know that mission, so that it becomes my default position. I fall into it again and again and again in crisis situations. I'm not saying I'm doing that, I'm saying that would be the ideal for me. So I look at a person like Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi lived in a time in world history where there was a very good chance he was going to get assassinated, and he was well aware of that. So how does he continue to confront, for instance, the British authorities, the caste system in India, the Brahmin group particularly, who were really upset with what he was doing, you know, the conflict between Islam and Hinduism? How did he hold center with all this, realizing he could be killed any moment? And he realized that, so he's responding out of a loving place, but he realizes at some stage he probably is going to have to pay for that alignment with his own life. So what does he do? He's constantly practicing a mantra, Rama, 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 Rama. He's constantly making that prayer, which is a prayer to the God, the source. And when the guy comes up in front of him and shoots him right there, what's the first thing out of his word? Oh my God, why did you do that? Immediately, Rama, 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 Rama. He went straight in to the default position because he practiced it. And so it's about practicing, you know, true love in all circumstances until finally, at some stage, maybe in incarnation number 45 down the road, I get it, that I will be in such alignment with my purpose and myself that my instinctive default position will be to do it lovingly, even if I have to do it in a confrontational situation. Yeah. Mike.
I have a note here.
You have notes? Okay.
Yeah. I want to see if I understand what you're saying. I'll try to say it.
If you do, let me know.
Okay. Right.
I'd like to know as well.
Well, I don't believe what I think either.
Okay.
But your overall theme, as I understand it, is that the universe, the purpose of it, the meaning of it, purpose is not a good word, the meaning of it is a growing of love. That's the first.
Charlie, you got it?
Second thing is, how do we, and it'd be interesting if all of us could answer this, how do we become aware of this? Okay. That's what awareness, I think, means. Being aware of the purpose,
yes.
the meaning,
yes.
the essence, love. How do we become aware of it? And each one of us, I think
Yes.
that would be
Yes.
personal.
Brilliant.
But it'd be very interesting.
Brilliant.
Some of us, nature, obviously
Sure.
you,
Okay.
is through nature.
Okay.
And then, what do we do to tap in to this movement of the cosmos?
Brilliant. Great. Three great questions. Well, you've answered the first one yourself, Mike. You got it right on. That my thesis is that the basic purpose for this universe of ours is that it is an emanation from source that's moving inexorably under cosmic laws, chief among which is the law of love as the origin and the destination. So you nailed that one right in the head. The second piece is then, how do we wake up? I think, firstly, we have to start looking at the fact that we are drawing our data points from a single state of consciousness. I call that the first reduction, that we live in a world of 4 reductions. The first reduction is that we've collapsed all states of consciousness down to this, what we grandiosely call waking consciousness, and we only accept data points from this one state of consciousness. And I'll expand on all of these in a moment. The second thing is that we take a radically non-representative sample of data from that one state of consciousness, and we act as if they are representative for the entire population. The third thing is we spin those non-representative data to a particular purpose, a political agenda or an economic agenda or a religious agenda. And fourthly, we allow people to do our thinking for us, and they give us the answers. They say, you don't have to think, we'll tell you. You need bigger pizzas or more Monday night football, whatever it is. So we've shrunken our reality down. So what do we need to do? We need to start investigating all states of consciousness. There are at least 8 states of consciousness available to us. There's this waking state of consciousness that happens between the time our alarm clock goes off in the morning and we go to bed at night. That's one state of consciousness, and it's an important state, but it's not the most important. A second state is when we dream. There's a whole bunch of more data points come into us in our dream life that most of us ignore. Vitally important data points. A third piece is in dreamless sleep. When we go into dreamless sleep, we are actually experiencing union with source. We are in contentless consciousness. And there's vital data that comes from that experience. We ignore it. A fourth piece might be hypnagogic consciousness, where we're hypnotized by something, whether it's TV or it's a story we've heard, or it's by a therapist doing a guided visualization with us. That's a fourth state of consciousness. Nature, mystical consciousness. If you go out into nature and you spend time in nature, there's a totally different state of consciousness that grips you, and very important data points address you from there. There's a sixth stage of consciousness, which would be deity, mystical consciousness. When you follow some kind of a guru, like a Jesus figure or a Buddha figure, when you have some kind of an incarnation of the divine or an avatar that you follow, then getting into union with such a being confers an extraordinary amount of wisdom through the pipeline. A seventh one would be formless mystical consciousness, where you experience in waking consciousness contentless consciousness. You can achieve that state in meditation, where there's no content to your consciousness. It's just the pure faculty of consciousness itself. And then an eighth one I would say would be non-dualistic mystical consciousness, where you have the ability to celebrate and walk in incarnation, but not identify with it, and identify with your source self, and to hold those two pieces seamlessly at the same time. So there'd be ways in which we could experience all of these kinds of things. So to answer your third question then, how do we go about undoing? I think it is vitally important for us in our times to start networking with individuals and small groups and journals and periodicals and internet sources that are showing us what exactly is happening in our world. There's a guy, for instance, called Paul Hawken. And Paul Hawken is, I heard him give a lecture one time up in San Rafael at a group called the Pioneers. And it went on from, the meeting happens on Friday evening, all day Saturday, finishes on Sunday at noontime. And Paul gave an hour-and-a-half presentation, and as he was talking, there was a screen behind him, and there was a list of names scrolling down on it, like you see at the end of a movie, with that kind of speed. And at the end of his presentation, he said, this is a list of organizations throughout the world that I've identified who are trying to raise human consciousness in agriculture, medicine, psychology, psychiatry, politics, economics, urban ministry, whatever. And he said, if I let that list roll down all day tomorrow, Saturday, and Sunday until we leave here, I still wouldn't finish that list. And just recently, I read a book by Ervin Laszlo, who mentions Paul Hawking, and he says he's identified 1 million social organizations on planet Earth right now dedicated to raising human consciousness on our planet. All the way between small groups of 50 members to large organizations of 50,000 people. So you're probably talking about something in the region of maybe 100 million people dedicated to the raising of human consciousness. How many of those do you know about from Fox News or the San Jose Mercury? You know, you're not going to get any of that there. And so you're absolutely right. It's really important, Mike, that we learn who these groups are and we begin to network with them and read their material and find out there are extraordinary things happening in our world right now. But all we hear about is the doom and gloom and terrorism and economic collapse and ecological degradation. Some of that is true, but it is a tiny percentage of what's happening on our planet. But most of us don't know of anything else.
So maybe there will be a quantum leap.
There will be. There will be a quantum leap. The question is, will we wake up in time to make it a quantum leap into a Christ consciousness or a quantum leap into oblivion? That's the question for us. Before 2012. I've hinted at this for the last 3 or 4 years in my homilies. I really believe, and I said it, was it last Sunday or the Sunday before, that what COJ has experienced in the last 5 months, by way of self-examination and turmoil and chaos, is a preparation for what's going to happen in our country and in our world in the next 2.5 years. And so it becomes very important for us that we get our act together as a group, that we focus on what is of beauty in this community and on the way forward as a group in this community, and not keep picking at stuff that went wrong in the past. Of course stuff went wrong in the past. There's no value in picking at that. The value is we've created a few different possibilities. Ron is leading one of them. Let's look at our bylaws. Let's look at our governance structures. Let's look at our programs. Let's look at our communication systems. Of course, but let's look at it as a way of making these implements for the Christ consciousness, not ways of kind of picking pot shots at people who made mistakes in the past. There's no value in that. We literally, my companions, we maybe have 2.5 years as species on planet Earth before this quantum leap is going to catch us. There's a whole confluence of stuff happening. And if we don't get our act together as individual people, if we don't get our act together as small little groups, and if we don't start networking with these other 1 million organizations out there so that we create a mass movement and a critical mass to make sure that the quantum leap is into Christ consciousness and not into a nuclear holocaust. It's up to every one of us to do that. Great question, Mike. Victoria.
I discovered this website recently that has really spoken to me about what you were just saying, and it talks about, because we are always looking at our points of view, what everybody else thinks, what our thoughts are, they call them points of view, and it's about being in awareness. So it's taking short moments of awareness, repeated many times, become automatic, and that's basically the mantra. But it's every time you're thinking of something, instead of entertaining your thoughts, you go into that moment of awareness, because thoughts come from nowhere and they go nowhere. It's just like watching those thoughts coming through and not entertaining them, not paying attention to them. We don't concentrate on that. We're concentrating on being, our awareness, which is where all of our, whatever we need to do in the moment will come from. We'll know automatically if we practice that. It's like practicing a language, practicing riding a bike, driving a car. Pretty soon it's automatic because we pay attention to that. So it's paying attention to awareness, being awareness that we're all one. It's the non-dual point of view. So, and it's what you were just talking about with the free will coming from love, coming that place of awareness. We do automatically what needs to be done in the moment. We know. We don't have to think about it. We don't have to ask someone. Everything we know or want is already here. So it's already present. It's just trusting that, which is awareness. Right.
Great. Thanks, Victoria. Thanks, Emmanuel. Karen.
So I have a question about something different, which is the deep dreamless sleep.
Okay.
If you said something about that we're ignoring it, and I have no memory of deep dreamless sleep. So I'm wondering how it nurtures us, and is it a sense of just well-being when you awaken? Or I'm just wondering how that works.
Great question. Thanks, Karen. So a few different ways of responding to it. The first thing is my deep belief system, and many of the great esoteric systems like Buddhism particularly and Hinduism, they pick up on this notion and they run with it. They claim that they can actually train people to have consciousness in deep dreamless sleep. But it's a contentless consciousness. So it is the difference between watching a river flow and watching the fish swim in the river. Yeah? But it's every single one of us gets into that place every night. So we spend probably 5, 6, maybe 4 or 5 hours every night totally at source. But we don't realize that, therefore we don't give any credence to it, and our models don't take that into effect. So if the reality is that of an average day you're spending 5 hours totally united with source, doesn't that say something about what you're waking consciousness with? How if you register that as a fact, how that would change your response to life? That's the first response I have. So the fact that we haven't acknowledged it, that we're at source, we're experiencing contentless consciousness at source, 5, 6 hours every night. That fact alone should totally change how we look at the other states of consciousness. That's the first piece of it. The second piece is occasionally it's possible to mine that place for experiences. I'm not trained in this, but on 3 different occasions in my life I've had an experience, the first 2 of which were really, really frightening. And the experience was, somehow or other, my consciousness was aware in that contentless consciousness. And it was a totally freaking out experience. I had no idea who I was. I had no idea when I was. I had no idea what I was. And I had no idea, what end was up. It was like being a little point of consciousness in utter no-thingness, and being really freaked out and think, I need to figure this one out quick, I'm going to just totally dissolve if I don't. And that happened to me twice spontaneously. And the third time it happened to me, for some reason or other, I had enough awareness to be able to say to myself, whatever the self was, I'm going to stay right here as long as here is here, and just see what happens. And I had no idea whether it was going to end in my annihilation, whether I would ever cease to be or ever wake up again as Sean O'Leary. I have no idea. And I have no idea how long it lasted. It may have been a nanosecond, it may have been half an hour, I have no idea. It's middle night, pitch dark. But I held myself right there until finally stuff just began to come in of its own volition. I didn't call it in, I didn't grasp onto it or kind of cue it up. I had the courage the third time just to stay with that pace. So I imagine it's something like that. I've only 3 experiences in my life. So I imagine that you probably could get trained to do stuff like that in the Buddhist system. So that's the second response to it. The third response is the realizations that, and Victoria is aiming at this as well, you can achieve that state in little bite-sized pieces in deep meditation. When you get into a place in meditation where there's a gap between 2 thoughts, then for that instant you're actually in that place. And you can cultivate that in your meditation so that you can try and create bigger and bigger gaps between physical sensations or emotional reactions or cognitive kinds of ruminations or whatever, and you can hold yourself in the gap just for that moment. And if you can string together, a concatenation of such moments, then you begin to realize that the faculty of consciousness is much more aware, is much more important than the contents presented to that consciousness. It's like you take your eyes as a gift. Can you appreciate the gift of sight in the absence of visual stimulus when it's pitch dark in a room? Can you still, appreciate the gift of sight, even though there's nothing registering on your sight right now, but you're aware of sightedness? Or you watch a movie and now the movie ends and there's nothing on the screen. Can you still celebrate sightedness in the absence of moving images on a screen? And that's the trick there, because it is consciousness per se is the nearest thing we come to God, that awareness is. And the contents of consciousness are just, they're passing clouds in an infinite sea, an infinite sky of blue. Yeah. I'm going to ask one question, guys. I'm dead happy to go on as long as you want. I just want to make sure that people don't have to feel that they have to remain here. If there's a kind of a workable quorum, I'll stay here. Okay. Good. Okay. So we'll excuse anybody who needs to go on. Ron has a question, and if anybody else wants to remain, Joy? Yeah, Ron had a question first. So let's, okay, love. God bless, love. Ron was first. Yeah, Ron was first.
it seems like the more people think they have an understanding of a common word, when you dig down into it, it becomes difficult. I thought I could have a conversation with anyone about what truth was, and 2 Sundays ago, you gave an astounding definition of truth. So I'm going to ask you, we talk a lot about love, and there have been many, many definitions of love, depending on circumstances, relationships, and so would you care to give a
love.
definition of love?
Okay. Wow. This is a brilliant question, Ron. Yes. Okay. Ron's question is brilliant. What would be, a definition of love? And just off the top of my head, here's what I would say. I would say that love is the radical alignment with Source, such that there is no part of ego or no part of the manifest intermediary realms obstructing the flow of grace. Yeah? And that I'm acknowledging that if it's a conversation, that I'm acknowledging that that is equally true of the other, and that therefore that at least from one side the channel is totally open to an alignment with Source and inviting a similar response from my partner in the conversation. Yeah. Yeah. Great, thank you, brother. Brigitte.
Evolving in any kind of biological sense,
Okay.
or is all the spiritual? Okay. My question is, we are basically descended from some kind of primate.
Right.
And I'm just wondering if one of the things that makes it so difficult for us to achieve your kind of consciousness, the consciousness that we all want, is we're still hampered by some of that territorial and other primate imperatives. We have not completely shed that. Is there anything we can do about that, or has evolution stopped as far as humans go?
The next stage of evolution is a second opposable thumb. We're going to have 2 opposable thumbs in one hand. Okay, I'm joking with you. Let me make a few responses to you, Brigitte. The first thing is that we have very significantly vilified our primate ancestry, or the nature out of which we have evolved. Because the truth is, nature is not red in tooth and claw only. Nature is not just this, competition for resources and the survival of the fittest. That's a tremendous libel on how nature operates. That's only one of the resources available to nature in its journey to survival and evolution. Much more, you see evidence for cooperation and symbiosis among life forms and between species. When you look at how nature operates, in like one of the prayers we use in the Eucharistic prayer is, God, you are the forest, a miracle of ecological cooperation. I spend hours and hours and hours in the forest every week just watching the extraordinary symbiosis and cooperation that's happening there. But it's not red in tooth and claw. That's only one particular kind of strategy that nature sometimes adopts in efforts at survival and evolution. So we've maligned, and libeled nature by ascribing to it only that particular facet. That's only one facet. That's the first piece. The second piece I would say is, yes, even physiologically, there is movement and there is evolution. Some of it very slow and some of it very fast. I remember, for instance, was it 1954 that Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile? Remember that? The 4-minute mile was like the holy grail of runners. And the feeling was actually that there was some kind of a physiological barrier and that human beings would actually never get beyond a 4-minute mile. And I think with maybe June 1954, Roger Bannister, a student at Oxford University, broke the 4-minute mile. Within a year, 15 other guys had done it. So it's like when you broke through the threshold, suddenly we're off and running. So it only takes some kind of a small group to create the energetic template in order for us to move through it, both physiologically, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually. So I think that we are moving, that modern human beings, I think kids are much brighter than my generation of kids was. That there are kids coming in now, you can sit a 2-year-old in front of a television and give him a remote control and he'll program the whole thing for you. Where the hell did he learn that? I have no idea. But that they're coming in with different, on the spectrum of human ability, they seem to have pushed it a little bit. The kids who are coming in, that's one piece of it. I think that for better or worse, that there's some kind of an alliance between humans and technology. And that part of the human evolution will be some kind of cooperating with, or maybe some kind of even, it may be even downloading of human abilities into machines that last longer than us and could travel into intergalactic space. So it might well be that we could take, the consciousness of Mary Kate Crawford, download it into a robot, part of a spaceship, and send it off, into intergalactic space, and that she would continue to live for 10,000 years and investigate, planet Zorg. That's possible. So it may well be that our physiological evolution, is still continuing, and that it involves some kind of a connection with technology of some kind. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, take your choice. But more importantly than that, it feels to me that when you look at the main trajectory of human evolution, we've gone from, when you look at the little baby in utero, the baby in utero recapitulates the entire phylogenetic evolution of our species. So there's a saying in biology, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. So the trajectory of a single human infant recapitulates the entire evolution of life on planet Earth, which is 3.7 billion years old. Life started with single-cell creatures called bacteria. And the baby starts as a single-cell creature that we call a zygote. And then it moves through, it becomes a water animal for a period. It's a sperm, it has a tail. So that recapitulates the fact that about 700 million years ago, marine life developed on this planet. And then at some stage it drops off the tail and it develops kind of limbs of various kinds. And this recapitulates the fact that 400 million years ago we became land animals. And then at some stage, the little baby is born, but it's not Homo erectus yet. It takes it a year to become Homo erectus. So for the first year, the little baby is crawling around. So it's like a little lizard or some kind of an amphibian. It's walking around. At some stage, 9 or 10 months, it picks itself upright and it becomes Homo erectus. But it's still not Homo sapiens. It's not able to think. But it develops, at some stage, a mammalian brain, which began only about maybe 300 million years ago. And that's the ability to emote. So it develops that ability to emote. About the age of 6 or 7, it truly becomes Homo sapiens. It can think and has language skills. Only about the age 13 does it develop the ability to really think abstractly and to critique its own performance and the performance of its parents and its culture. And so you look at what the baby is doing, and it's recapitulating, in one lifespan, what has taken us maybe 3.7 billion years to achieve. But the trajectory is going beyond body and beyond emotions and beyond mentation. It's going into the realm of psychic gifts, and it's going into the realm of soul gifts. And so I believe that the next phases of human evolution won't be primarily physiological, and they won't be primarily mental in the sense that we'll develop more intelligence, but that we will be more in touch with our psychic abilities, and that much more importantly, we'll be really in radical connection with our soul selves. And that's where it's headed. If we get enough time, that's where we're headed. Now, we're going to be happy and shocked that there are lots of other beings who've already reached that place. Long, long, long time before we did. And they may come to visit us, or we may get to visit them, but they exist. There are planetary systems in our universe which are 3 times older than planet Earth. The universe itself is 13.7 billion years of age. Planet Earth is only 4.5. So there are civilizations out there who are literally billions of years ahead of us, and presumably they're beings who have developed the highest levels of spirituality. Maybe that's what angels are. And so if our trajectory survives, it won't be just about physiological prowess or intellectual attainments. It'll be about developing our psychic gifts and developing our spiritual gifts. Guys, get on to 1 o'clock. I'm gonna, Joy, one last question. Okay, Dan. Thank you, Pat.
I'm having a problem with this question, so hopefully you can help me. But I'm looking at your outline here, and I'm having a hard time beginning at the beginning, the language of God, the theologian, using you as an example, and teacher. Theologians, I understand, would probably speak to the masses. Because if we go back to our Eucharistic prayer, it says, "Are you a creator God?" And the outline says, "You're not a creator God."
Yes.
And we say, yes. So were you talking to the masses rather than using the word immanent because you felt that the larger part of the congregation would not understand and you didn't have time to do the teaching?
Okay. So there's two questions embedded in that, Joy. And the first response is that theologians don't talk to the masses. Theologians talk to other theologians. That's the problem. Teachers talk to the masses. So unfortunately, theologians live in little, ivory towers where they talk to each other about stuff that, they don't understand, but they have nice words to kind of make conversation. When I said to you before that I did not write the Prayer of the Cosmos, I channeled it in a 2-hour session in May of 2007. Even if you channel stuff, all that can come through, everything that comes through is going to be coloured by the personality through whom it comes. At that stage of my thinking, I had never really thought about the difference between creation and emanation. Since then, in my meditation, I've come to the realization that God is not a creator God. If I were to channel that prayer today, I think it would come out slightly differently. In one or two other areas, that was that was as clear a channel as it could be in May of 2007. If I were channeling it in May of 2010, I think it would be only very slightly, it would be a slightly different document. And so I wasn't actually holding back because I didn't think people were ready for it. I was holding back because I wasn't aware of it yet myself. Yeah. Guys, Margaret, okay, I'll indulge.
I volunteered to be one of the presiders when you're gone. I'm having trouble. On Friday you said the Eucharist is a metaphor. I don't believe that this is the body of Christ. How can we say that with what we're learning?
Okay, that's a great question. So the thing is, I believe it is the body of Christ, but not the body as we understand body. Mostly when we think about body of Christ, we think about, the cells and his flesh and his ligaments and his tendons and his big toes and his kidneys and stuff like that. That is not the body of Christ with which we're in communion. As I point out on Friday in my homily, the Greeks used 3 different words for body. So they use the word sarx, which is this stuff, flesh, and they use the word soma, which is the energy template behind, this physical body, and they use the word pneuma, which is spirit body. And as I said on Friday, Paul was very definite. Paul talks about the Eucharist in the first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 11. And Paul is using 3 different words, sarx, soma, and pneuma. And he says very definitely, speaking of Eucharist, sarx cannot inhabit the kingdom of heaven. So he said, in other words, on the night he was betrayed, Paul says, Christ took bread and he says, this is my body. Paul is very definitely saying Christ was not talking about his physical flesh. He's talking about either soma or pneuma. But we miss that. In chapter 15 of the same letter, Paul talks about resurrection. And he says, that which is put into the ground and that which comes out of the ground, they're very different. You don't plant an apple tree to get an apple tree. You plant a seed, which gives birth to a tree, which gives birth to the apples, which gives birth to the seed, that gives birth to the tree, that gives birth to the apples. And so an apple tree, if you were an alien and you had never seen agriculture, and somebody showed you a tiny seed and said, watch this, and you put it into the ground and you said to him, watch this now growing, and you could fast forward in time. The alien would expect that a seed would come out, maybe a bigger seed or maybe more seeds. He would not expect that you would get a radically different thing completely, a tree coming out of it. He would be totally shocked by it. So Paul is saying, what we put into the ground and what comes out of it is totally different. So what we put into the ground is the physical body. You die, you get buried in the ground. Paul says, you're foolish to think that that's what comes back out. It doesn't. What comes out is radically different because what's going in is sarx and what's coming out is pneuma. And so when I celebrate Eucharist, for me Eucharist is the body and blood of Jesus in the deepest sense of all, that it is the essence of Christ consciousness. I do not believe that when I'm holding the host up that I have to hold it carefully in case Jesus falls and breaks his hip. Yeah? I do not believe that there's a ligament here, or there's tendons here, or there's a kidney in there someplace. I believe that this is a portal, and that I can move through this portal and have a radically transformative experience with Christ consciousness as a result of passing through this portal. So it really is the body of Christ, but it's the body of Christ at a totally exalted level, not just the physical flesh of him. So do your damnedest, Mag. I'm going to finish, guys. I'm going to leave you with just one final kind of an invitation. Every year on my birthday, I write out a kind of a vision for myself for the year ahead, and I break it into a bunch of categories. I look at what good spiritual health would look like for me, good mental health, good dream health, good emotional health, good physical health, good relationship health, good financial health, and good mission health would look like for me. And I create a prayer for each of these categories. And when I get out of bed in the morning, I pray that prayer. And every year I revise it and put things in that weren't there, or leave things out that have been accomplished. I want to just offer you the first piece of this because it's very apropos a question that a few of you asked today. And it's because every single one of us is emanation from Source. We're all part of Source. But we need to start making that much more, bringing it into our awareness. So here's the very first paragraph in that prayer. And I throw it out there for you to create something of your own that meets that need in yourself. And I say this. I say, I am plugged into the universe so deeply that I'm a channel for love and light and life, for wisdom and for information, which I fully comprehend and cross-fertilize with my own experience. I remember it in detail, I recall it at will, and I speak it passionately. So some way that we can consciously start plugging into Source. We really desperately need it as a world community right now. And the truth is we're all from Source, and therefore we're all connected to Source. But most of us are asleep on the job, and we're not activating that line. And so to try to bring some kind of morning offering to your day, that you start off the day, consciously connecting to who you really are and opening up the channels so that you become a conduit for that level of love and light and life and wisdom and understanding to flow into our world and into our times. Namaste.